Okay, so good morning. All right, so first of all, my name is Andy Barker. I'm the pre-sessional program manager from University of Lincoln, so just down the road, which is very convenient. And also the deputy head of the International College for the university as well. So lovely to see you all. Obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about EAP Classroom Practice from the perspective of observation. And I'm going to talk really personally about what we do at the University of Lincoln with observation. It's going to be quite directed at pre-sessional, but we do actually apply the same principle to in-sessional, and I also run all of the PD across both pre and in-sessional. So I'm happy to talk a bit about that as well. What I've really found by putting this together actually is that EAP observation is a bit like going into Wonderland, hence the looking for reference, obviously. I felt that once I'd opened that doorway, I wasn't quite sure which direction I could continue to head in, which was mildly terrifying, but nonetheless we'll continue. Hopefully that works. Good. Now, of course, as we know, the overarching theme of this PIM is about teacher journey into teacher educator. And I think it's worthy of note, and actually, of course, listening to Lindsay this morning, she's already made reference to this. It's going to be interesting as this day progresses, how ELT background kind of really helps to jettison people into this program, I think, as well. So we'll think about that a little bit as well from the point of view of observation. Now, over the next sort of short bit of time, I'm going to talk, obviously, first of all, about observation purpose. You know, I'm going to talk about the purpose of observation both from the viewpoint of the observer and the person being observed. I'm going to talk about observation process. I'm going to basically talk about what we do in the University of Lincoln, what process we've applied, and how important it is to have standardization as a process, why that's important. I'm going to talk a little bit about observation criteria. Now I'm going to talk a bit about observation criteria again at the end, because that's a minefield, which I look forward to opening. But really criteria, what is it we're looking for? Why are we looking for that? What should we be looking for? I think there's some interesting, different, conflicting reading about this area. I'm going to talk a little bit about observation feedback. I think we all know that observation feedback needs to be meaningful, agreed, reflected upon, needs to be all those things. Perhaps it isn't always all of those things, but it needs to be. And then I'm going to talk finally about next steps. And that's really sort of more from a personal perspective in terms of what I think are the next steps that we need to do where I work. And that may or may not apply to you, I don't know, but we'll find out. Okay, so first of all, a bit about the purpose of observation. Now, as I say, I'm going to talk about this from the two opposite points, which is the point of the observed and the point of the observer. So first of all, from the perspective of the person being observed is professional development. Now, that's clearly one of the most common reasons why we go through an observation, or why, as a manager, we tell people we're going to come and observe them, is for their professional development, for your growth, it's for opportunity for you to succeed. It's sold on that premise. Hopefully it is delivered on that premise as well. Hopefully it gives people opportunity to transgress from an EAP teacher into an EAP teacher educator. So I think professional development as a key component is very important. Now, the next part of that is about reaffirming and challenging your beliefs as a teacher. Now, I think observation, when done well, is an opportunity for teachers to try different things. It's an opportunity for them to challenge themselves a bit more. And it's an opportunity for us as an educator or manager of teaching staff. It's an opportunity for us to challenge our beliefs, actually, in terms of what things we think are going to work, and then actually they do. You'll be surprised. That can be very nice. The other thing is about showcasing your strengths. Now, I think that when done well, it's an opportunity for teachers to demonstrate different materials and to demonstrate different activities. I know actually, for definite from personal experience, this particular summer, there was one of our new teachers who was able to demonstrate a really successful running dictation for passive and active. It was a great activity, students were engaged. There was opportunity for us to stretch the activity further, and then opportunity for that individual to share that with the other cohort of teaching staff. So it's an excellent moment, I think, for people to showcase and shine a light on what they do. Because I think, as we know, normally teaching is a very isolated profession. Now, from the point of view of the observer, so the first thing here really is about, as a manager or as a teacher educator, it's about us being able to put a stamp of quality on our department, on who we are and who we say that we are. And I think that that's particularly important because, and forgive me, but I've worked in a few places, and quite often the EAP department can sit, oh, is it in applied linguistics, or is it in social services, or is it in support services, or is it in professional services? Where do we sit? I think because we tend to sort of have this varied, perhaps, sort of variety in who we are, then I think it's very important that we do things like observations, that we can stamp quality on, saying that practice is good. The benefit, of course, of observation from the observer's point of view is for us to identify the needs of our teaching staff, for us to identify the needs of our college as a whole, perhaps our student body, because we can look at it from a different angle. And that way we can then provide targeted and appropriate professional development to the teams. The thing I put there is about team building. Now, I think observation allows us an opportunity as a teacher educator to sit down with a teacher and have a frank conversation about their teaching practice, about what they're going to be doing in a very interesting and informative way. And I think it's very important for team building because, as I say, I manage particularly pre-sessional programs, and often with pre-sessional programs, not for everybody, but often you have teachers that come into your campus for 5 weeks, and then you wave goodbye and see you next year. So you don't really know them very well. So actually doing this kind of observation process with them allows you to find a middle ground, to find a conversation point, and to take an interest in them and to find out what you can do to help them continue to grow, even if they're not part of your permanent team. So, unfortunately, I wanted to actually just mention very briefly that quote on the bottom there, but I'm going to read it to you, even though you can't see it. I apologise. And it's the only quote I'm going to read. Don't worry, you can get the rest later. It's quite an interesting one, basically, because what it says essentially is we wanted teachers who were neither guides on the side, facilitators, or sages on the stage, sages on the stage, lecturers, but rather that were meddlers in the middle, organising the messiness. Meddlers in the middle. It's by Kirk and King. You'll see it at the end of the reference list. I'm going to flag it up now because I'm going to make a specific point about this later on. Okay, about how we kind of can perceive these EAP teachers. Okay. So the observation process, what do? Well, of course, there's different documentation that is prepared, and you're going to see that in just a moment. We'll talk about that. So we prepare different documents, the teacher prepares documents, we meet with the teacher, we have a conversation with them about the documents. Then is the class, of course, the presentation really, the lecture itself, the seminar, the workshop, whatever it might be. And then we reflect. So then the teacher will reflect, and then we will reflect, and we'll reflect together. So let's just have a look at that in a little bit more detail. Forgive me, because I was sitting right in the back of it, because I was curious to see what it would look like. I think it's going to look... What I will say is, essentially, this is the first page of our teacher observation document. Essentially speaking, up here, you have the main objectives of the session, probably obvious stuff that we all use very similar versions of. And then below that, you have the lesson sequence. So really what you're looking for is, of course, is the teacher, are they able to tell us about what the learning goals are? Of course, they better be. And then, of course, the sequence, how are they going to get to that point where they've achieved those learning goals? Again, apologies, it's quite small. The next page, and again, we keep these quite brief, this lesson paperwork is deliberately not too cumbersome for staff. because we observe all of our teachers, you know, even if you're only with us for 5 weeks, we're still going to come and observe you. So we want to keep this process as workable and realistic for everybody. So the next bit there is about anticipating problems, of course, and therefore predicting hopefully solutions to the problems. The next one is about the resources and the materials. What are people using? And finally, and actually I want to draw specific attention to this because I found this year that this is actually one of the most important parts of the whole document, is actually this observation task, which is optional. So let me just there. Is there anything you would like the observer to provide feedback on? I found using that this year, that was a real eye-opener. Learned a lot about the teaching staff by what they would put in the box. It really helped me to sort of hone in on, okay, there's perhaps some trends occurring, because there were a couple of teachers who didn't know each other, because this was for our online program, that were working in different countries, but put the exact same thing. And it's very interesting, I think, because it tells us, okay, this is what current people are thinking about. So this is what we could look at doing professional development on, support on, and perhaps what I need to think more about with other future courses or future student materials. It's very interesting. I think it also helps us as an observer to have an area to really focus in on ourselves, so that we know that we can make it definitely applicable to the individual, the feedback that we give. And the other documents is, so after the class itself has occurred, the teacher will then complete their post-lesson reflection, and they will do this before we meet them. So the post-lesson reflection, what went well, what could have gone differently, what did you expect, etc. And the last question there, have you gained any insights from the session that you would like to share with anybody else? I'm not particularly happy with that part, I have to say. Didn't really generate a lot of information, but I'm going to think about it as we go on. Now, observation criteria. And this is a bit of a sticking point that I'm going to come on to in a bit more detail. Observation criteria. Well, of course, first and foremost is the curriculum. Is the lesson that I'm witnessing part of the curriculum? How does it fit into the curriculum? Does it fit into the curriculum? Hopefully so. So that's an important question to obviously think about when we know that we're going to be conducting observation. Criteria is planning. What has the teacher expected to occur versus what is actually going to then occur? How have they staged the class? What activities or are there activities? What do they think they're going to do to achieve their learning aims? Pedagogy is an important part of our criteria. And this is something I'm going to discuss again in a little bit, because this is the bit more of a sticking part I've found. When we think about pedagogy, so we think, first of all, the EAP competency framework, first of all, they outline that communicative language teaching is an important strategy when delivering EAP. So, you know, things therefore obviously like task-based learning, project-based learning, communicative approaches. All of these things are great because, of course, as we know, they provide opportunity for learners to engage in materials in a different way, for them to discuss them, for them to analyse them. And the competency framework itself also identifies that teachers have got a range of skills that they can utilise in the classroom. And this is, again, picking up actually, Lindsay sort of made an interesting point about this earlier. I've found as well that in my experience, teachers who come into EAP from an ELT background often find those teaching dynamics a bit easier. I'm not saying they're better teachers, before anybody shoots me. I'm just saying that they often find it a bit easier sometimes going in to do different things with the classroom because they have different. But again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. So for our approach, what did we do for the criteria? Well, prompt sheets, first of all, for the observer. Now the prompt sheets, I will show you just here, and apologies at the back because you're not going to see that. But the prompt sheet, which has changed a lot in the process of the entire summer program, is designed to simply give ideas to the person observing about the kind of thing that they might want to look at, the kind of thing that might occur. And I apologize, I can see you straining. Now, originally we thought, okay, we're going to use this and maybe only give this back to teachers, hence why we have the boxes here: successful, needs development, not applicable. But as I say, we actually decided to bin that. We didn't feel it was useful as a criteria for teachers. We felt that it would actually become too prescriptive to give that to a teacher and say, there you go, I'm going to assess you on all of these wonderful things. How are you going to do that in such a short amount of time? It's not realistic, in my opinion. It's useful as a guide, but not realistic to hold someone accountable to it. And we also felt that if we were to apply this type of criteria, then observation becomes more of a tick box activity and less about individual growth. Observation feedback. Feedback is, of course, the same as most other places that have been worked at before. But I think when we think about feedback, first of all, it's important to remember the purpose of feedback. Now, I know that may sound like a silly question to think about what are we doing feedback for, but actually I think it's very important to remember that this observation feedback is for the individual, it's for them to grow, it is for them to be able to continue their growth, to enhance their career, perhaps for those teachers to become teacher educators as well. So just really focus in on why we're doing this before we do it. Now, our feedback itself is made up in 3 stages. The first one, of course, as we've already seen, is the post-lesson feedback from the teacher. Post-lesson feedback from the teacher is completed on the same day. There's no real reason, I don't think, why they shouldn't do it on the same day. I feel that by doing it on the same day, everything's fresh. You can really think about it before you sleep on it too much and overthink it. It can be a problem. After you've filled in the feedback form, you would then meet with the observer to have a conversation about the class itself and what has occurred. And then after that, the observer will complete their post-lesson feedback, which will be the strengths of the session, particular items or areas for development, and some possible general comments. Now, again, this is only filled in after a meeting with the person you have observed, so there shouldn't be any surprising information on here. They should be well aware of what you're going to write, and I'm sure it's always been a very equitable and agreed process. All right. Now, the other point on here I mentioned about feedback is review. And really this happens then at the end of the period of time when you've completed all of your observations. You're then able to complete a review based on the data, based on information you've gathered about all the teachers that you've seen. So you can then start to think about, are there any trends? Are there any things, common things that you've seen, common things that have occurred? And what have you witnessed? What can you plan for your professional development sessions to hopefully, improve those areas? Okay. And also obviously, which teachers have you got that you can demonstrate and that they can have opportunity to showcase their own skills and to become teacher educators themselves. Final thing I put on there is resistance and our learning. And I put on there resistance, first of all, because I always love a bit of resistance. Really because as a manager, as a teacher educator, you always have to consider that there will always be some resistance somewhere down the road to whatever program it is you want to put in place, to however you want to go about doing something. There's always an alternative, wrongly or rightly. So I just put that up there really as a mental note to myself, to always think that it's going to happen, therefore don't worry too much when it does. The final thing on there is about our learning. Now, really, on here, as I've alluded to earlier, the criteria for observation I have found to be the biggest headache. And the reason why I found that to be the biggest headache is because I know what I know as an individual, I know what good teaching looks like. I come from an education background, I come from a teaching background, pedagogy background, and I have moved over into EAP throughout my time in education. Now, I know that there are some excellent teachers who have not come from educational backgrounds, by the way, just to put that out there. I know that there are excellent teachers who have jumped straight into EAP with a master's in applied linguistics because they have some content knowledge. Great. But I also know that sometimes those two things sit at opposite ends to each other in terms of what actually occurs in the classroom. Now, I think that's why what is the criteria, what do I hold people accountable to in some way? What do I look for? That is a larger question. I think it's an important question because if I think, for example, this year, at the start of this year, I was with a couple of colleagues conducting interviews, a couple of senior colleagues conducting interviews for teachers. And it became apparent actually that after one of the interviews, one of the candidates had left, who were very lovely, I realized that I had to explain the terminology that they had used to my two senior colleagues, because my two senior colleagues did not know about education in the same way that I do. The same way that I do not know about linguistics that they do. So you admit that. But it's interesting. It's like, okay, so if we're going to hold ourselves accountable to standards for teachers, how do we know where we all sit? How do we have a standardized approach to that? So I think I don't have the answer to that question. I'm just saying that is a question that we have. It's also important, I think, when conducting observations this summer, there was, for example, one of the teachers I observed who is an associate lecturer, very lovely individual, nice rapport with the students. But when it came to any kind of alternate dynamic, was there any peer work? No. Was there a question? Did everybody understand? Do you understand? Yes, okay, great, brilliant. I'll take that as read, let's move on. Rather than different dynamics within the class occurring. Now, did the students still learn stuff? Did they still pass this course? Yes, they did. They did do that. But did I feel satisfied personally watching that class? Not as satisfied as I like to be. And these, I think, are just different challenges that we face, all of us face within EAP. Because I think within EAP, as mentioned earlier by Lindsay, we come across from different angles sometimes, and we find ourselves we've arrived at this point of EAP from different routes, much looking at us anyway. That is everything from me. I'm happy to, of course, take any questions. Thank you very much. Well, there's my references.